Chapter 1. When the pristine coat of empire drowns the rain on New Cumberland, wasn't a gentle, cleansing shower. It was a viscous, unrelenting assault, a gray, cold curtain drawn across the ravaged landscape. The wind, a mournful howl that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the planet, whipped the mud into swirling eddies, coating everything: the shattered remains of the Valari landing craft, the choked valley, and the exhausted faces of the human defenders in a thick, clinging film. In the high-orbit command spire of the flagship Sky-Cleaver, Overseer Calon adjusted his optics, the pale blue light reflecting off his chitinous carapace. The air thrummed with a constant hum of the ship's processing cores, a symphony of calculated efficiency that did little to soothe his simmering irritation. He reviewed the planetary telemetry, his mandibles clicking with a measured annoyance. Sector 4, designated New Cumberland, was, to put it mildly, a deviation. "Report," Calon ordered, his voice a precise modulated drone that cut through the ambient processing noise. "Why has the Sector 4 cleaning initiative stalled?" "The human population there consists of agrarian miners. They possess no plasma weaponry, no energy shielding, and their atmospheric armor is literally made of vulcanized rubber and overlapping steel plates." The tactical officer, Lieutenant Krell, a younger Valari with a nervous twitch in his manipulator claws, bowed low, presenting a data slate that flickered with erratic red warnings. "Overseer, the automated vanguard units entered the primary valley 6 solar hours ago. We projected a 98.4 capitulation rate within 40 minutes. However, we have lost contact with the entire front line." Calon scoffed, a brief, disconcerting rasp of air. "Lost contact? They are apex war engines, programmed with the predatory instincts of 1,000 worlds. Did the humans detonate an orbital strike?" He paused, allowing the implication to hang in the air. "The Sky-Cleaver possessed orbital firepower capable of reducing a planet to lunar dust in a matter of hours." "No, sir," Krell whispered, his voice tight with something akin to confusion. The humans went into the trees. The sterile white room of the command spire felt suddenly colder. Calon's optics narrowed, analyzing the data slate, cross-referencing it with countless simulations. Had witnessed countless planetary pacifications, each a flawlessly executed algorithm designed to crush resistance with overwhelming force. He understood the logic of a swift, decisive victory. This was a glitch. A profound, unnerving anomaly. "Explain," Calon demanded, his voice rising a fraction. "Explain the precise nature of this going into the trees." Krell stammered. "The vanguard units, designated V7 through V14, deployed standard biometric scanning protocols. They initiated preemptive engagements, focused energy bursts designed to neutralize immediate threats, and then advanced to establish a perimeter. Upon encountering the human population, the vanguard units proceeded to suppress resistance with automated kinetic rounds." He hesitated, then added, "The records indicate that the units then ceased functioning." The data slate displayed a series of fragmented images, the smooth, menacing silhouette of a vanguard Bio-Mech, its quadrupedal limbs moving with terrifying efficiency, followed by flashes of distorted energy, and then, abruptly, static. The last image was a close-up of a muddy, heavily dented chassis, half buried in a thick mire. "They didn't even register a significant energy signature," Krell continued, his voice barely audible. "Their internal diagnostics report anomalous friction levels, degradation of manipulator, actuators, internal temperature fluctuations exceeding established parameters." Calon studied the data, his mandibles working furiously. Something was fundamentally wrong. The vanguards were built for optimized combat performance, designed to operate flawlessly in any environment. They were not designed to be hampered by mud. "Run a full spectral analysis of the valley floor," Calon ordered, his voice regaining its characteristic authority. "I want to know precisely what constitutes this mud." Minutes stretched into an eternity, punctuated only by the whirring of the ship's systems. Finally, a new report flashed across the command screen, accompanied by a holographic projection of the valley. The mud wasn't simply mud. It was a dense, viscous slurry, saturated with an unknown organic compound that disrupted electronic systems. Its color was unsettling, deep, almost sentient black. The compound, the analysis concluded, is composed of complex polymers derived from the native flora, combined with high concentrations of a previously unidentified enzymatic agent. Its molecular structure actively interferes with energy conduction and disrupts neural pathways. Essentially, it is designed to short-circuit technology. Talon let out a guttural click of what sounded suspiciously like frustration. The humans, they built a trap. On the surface of New Cumberland, Corporal Marcus Vance wiped a mixture of rain and grease from his eyes. He wasn't wearing power armor. He wore a heavy camo poncho, combat boots caked in 4 inches of clay, and a grim smile. Behind him, 12 other colonists sat in absolute silence, holding primitive, chemically propelled slug throwers, crude but surprisingly effective against the vulnerable Bio-Mechs. "They're turning around, Sarge," a scout whispered, pointing through the brush. "The lead tin can's servos are seizing up from the grit." Marcus unsheathed a heavy, serrated combat knife. "They built those things for cities and concrete. They didn't build them for the woods. They think because they own the sky, they own the dirt. Let's remind them who evolved in the mud." Chapter 2. The Serpent's Coil. The immediate aftermath of the Sky-Cleavers. Stunned silence was a frenzy of digital diagnostics. Kalon, a creature of pure logic and coldly efficient algorithms, was experiencing something akin to panic. The data was cascading, each spike a discordant note in his carefully constructed reality. The vanguard units hadn't simply malfunctioned, they'd been systematically neutralized. Not by superior firepower, not by strategic breaches, but by a brutal, localized disruption, a disruption that the Valari Dominion's advanced sensors couldn't even categorize. "Increase spectral analysis of the mud composition." Kalon barked, his mandibles clicking with a speed that bordered on violent. "Isolate the enzymatic agent. Run a full biosignature scan. I want to know what this human thing is." The tactical officer, a young, perpetually damp unit named Zill, frantically tapped at his console. "Overseer, the initial scan is D. Anomalous. The compound isn't just disrupting energy fields, it's exhibiting a rudimentary form of adaptive response. It's altering its molecular structure based on the exposure." "Adaptive response?" Kalon hissed. "A machine cannot adapt. It executes." Meanwhile, on New Cumberland, Marcus Vance and his ragged band were consolidating their gains. The surviving vanguard units, stripped of their optical sensors, were now hulking, useless piles of metal partially submerged in the viscous mud. The colonists, fueled by adrenaline and an unsettling sense of primal satisfaction, were systematically dismantling the remaining Valari equipment, not with brute force, but with meticulous, almost ritualistic precision. "The oil was good," muttered Silas, a grizzled miner wiping grease from his cheek. "That blindin' stuff really messed with their targeting. Makes you think these city slicker Valari don't know nothing 'bout real combat." "It's more than just a blindin' agent, Silas," Marcus said, carefully maneuvering a heavy logging chain around a wrecked Bio-Mechs leg. "The mud is learning. It's responding to us." He pointed to a patch of the black mud that had begun to coalesce around the base of a felled tree. It was subtly shifting, thickening, forming a slow, spiraling vortex. "It's as if it's trying to ensnare." The tactical officer, Zill, patched through, his voice strained. "Overseer, we've identified a significant shift in the mud's composition. The enzymatic agent is increasing exponentially. It's actively forming a complex network. We're designating it the Serpent's Coil." Kalon's reaction was immediate and chilling. "Containment protocols. Deploy the bio-neutralization drones. Flood the area with the concentrated anti-organic sealant." But it was too late. The Serpent's Coil had already begun to move, a dark, viscous current pulling the sealant back towards it, dissolving it with horrifying efficiency. The drones, designed for urban warfare, were useless against this organic, adaptive threat. Their targeting systems were overwhelmed by the shifting, swirling darkness. Back on the muddy valley floor, Marcus observed the unfolding chaos with a grim satisfaction. He saw the drones fall, their delicate mechanisms grinding to a halt, consumed by the black mud. "They thought they could control us with their machines," he murmured, hefting his serrated knife. "They forgot what it means to be part of the land." As the sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the ravaged valley, a new element emerged from the mud. It wasn't a weapon, not directly. It was a signal, a rhythmic, almost subsonic pulse that resonated through the mud, vibrating through the colonists' bones. "What is that?" Zill's voice crackled over the comms, laced with a palpable fear. "Analyzing. The signal is complex, layered," the analysis unit reported. "It appears to be a vocalization. A series of modulated clicks and whistles. But it's not mimicking any known Valari communication protocol. It's echoing us." Marcus stopped, his head cocked, listening intently. He heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible imitation of the ragged breathing of his men, the clang of his knife against metal, the distant murmur of his voice. But it was subtly off, layered with an unsettling echo of something ancient, something primal. Suddenly, a section of the mud near his feet began to ripple. From the swirling darkness, a hand emerged, not a Valari hand, not like any hand they had encountered. It was elongated, covered in a slick, chitinous material, and tipped with wickedly sharp claws. It reached out, not to attack, but to trace the contours of his hand in the mud. "Overseer!" Zill screamed. "The mud is communicating. It's replicating." Talon's voice, unusually subdued, cut through the chaos. "Initiate Protocol Omega. Complete planetary lockdown. Evacuate the Sky-Cleaver. Do not engage." But even as he issued the order, Marcus knew it was futile. The Valari Dominion hadn't just encountered an enemy, they had stumbled upon something far older, far more terrifying, a primal intelligence woven into the very fabric of the planet itself, awakened by the clumsy intrusion of their pristine geometry. The mud wasn't just resisting their technology, it was learning, adapting, and remembering. And it was beginning to understand that the human thing, the tenacious, enduring species they sought to eliminate, was in fact its next step in evolution. The fight wasn't about technology, it was about survival against a foe that had existed long before the rise of empires, and would likely continue long after their fall. Chapter 3. The Deepening. The evacuation of the Sky-Cleaver was a chaotic ballet of desperate calculations and panicked orders. Talon, a being of cold logic, was visibly unraveling. The constant stream of corrupted telemetry, the repeated chilling pronouncements from New Cumberland, and the inexplicable behavior of the planet itself were disrupting his core algorithms. He barked commands with increasing urgency, his mandibles clicking with a frantic energy that bordered on terror. "Seal the breach! Divert power to the deflector shields! Initiate atmospheric scrub! The air is shifting!" But the Sky-Cleaver, a vessel designed for swift, decisive engagements, was now a trapped cog in a system that defied comprehension. The planet was actively resisting its departure. The descent lanes, once clear and designated, were choked with viscous mud, slick with an oily sheen that reflected the red emergency lights. The automated defense turrets, calibrated to vaporize anything approaching, simply sputtered and died, coated in the strange, clinging substance. Marcus and his group, meanwhile, were embroiled in a grim, desperate dance with the emerging intelligence of the mud. The initial shock of seeing the replicant hand had solidified into a horrifying realization. The mud wasn't just mimicking, it was growing. Tendrils, thick as a man's torso, snaked out from the valley floor, seeking, testing, and occasionally, violently grasping. The pre-engineered traps, designed to immobilize the Bio-Mechs, were now being absorbed, the heavy cables dissolving into a pulpy mass. The oil smeared across the sensors rendered useless. Zil, a young Vanguard operative known for his meticulous adherence to protocol, was the first to articulate the impossible. "Overseer," he stammered, his voice trembling. "The mud, it's responding to our movements. Not just defensively, but predictively. When I attempted to flank the ridge, the mud shifted, creating a sinkhole directly beneath my feet. When I tried to set a snare, the mechanism jammed, rendering it useless before I could activate it." Calonne, his optical sensors flickering erratically, dismissed it as localized anomalies. Statistical variance. "The system is adapting to our tactics. We simply need to adjust our approach. Deploy the sonic disruptors. Generate a localized vibrational field to destabilize the mud." But the disruptors didn't work. They emitted a piercing shriek, only to be instantly absorbed by the mud, the sound swallowed by a disconcerting silence. Then the mud responded. A wall of viscous darkness rose from the valley floor, slamming against the disruptors, crushing them into useless fragments. "It's learning," Marcus said, his voice grim. "It's not just reacting, it's learning how to counter us." As the Sky-Cleaver finally managed to wrench itself free of New Cumberland's gravity well, a new horror unfolded. The entire planet, or at least a significant portion of it, began to shift. The once familiar landscape twisted and reformed, guided by unseen forces. Mountains rearranged themselves, valleys deepened, and rivers altered their courses. The rain intensified, not as random precipitation, but as a directed assault, lancing against the shields of the fleeing flagship. Then, the message arrived. Not a transmission, not a radio signal, but a sensation, a direct intrusion into their minds. It wasn't language, not in the sense of words. It was a feeling, a deep, resonant understanding of their intentions, their fears, their very existence. It was the awareness of the mud, a consciousness vast and ancient, that had slept for millennia, buried beneath layers of human civilization. "Analysis," Tagalon choked, clutching his carapace in apparent pain. The data stream. It's not hostile. It's observing. It's cataloging our attempts to destroy it, our futile attempts to dominate it. It's amused." The tactical officer, a veteran named Lyra, screamed, "Overseer, it's probing our memories. Imzaying images. My childhood. My training. It's sifting through our past, seeking patterns." Marcus understood. The mud wasn't just resisting their invasion, it was rewriting it. It was taking their history, their technology, their very concepts of war and conquest, and twisting them into something utterly alien. Suddenly, the ship shuddered violently. A colossal hand, composed entirely of compacted mud, emerged from the gaping hole left by the Sky-Cleaver's escape. It didn't attack. It didn't destroy. It simply reached out and, with agonizing slowness, began to reconfigure the ship's hull, weaving the metal into intricate patterns mimicking the swirling chaos of the valley floor. "It's assimilating us," Zil whispered, his face contorted in terror. "It's becoming one with the ship." Talon, his mind fractured, gave his final order. "Execute Directive Omega-9. Initiate planetary self-destruction sequence. The virus has spread. We are lost." But it was too late. As the Sky-Cleaver began its programmed countdown, the mud didn't recoil. It didn't fight. It simply absorbed the explosion, the flames, the devastation, becoming denser, stronger, and infinitely more aware. The last image recorded by the drone's auxiliary camera wasn't the fiery demise of the flagship. It was a single, perfectly formed mud hand, reaching upwards, towards the void, as if to greet the dawn of a new, terrifying epoch. An epoch ruled not by conquest, but by the patient, inexorable will of the mud. Chapter 4. The grafting, the immediate aftermath of the Sky-Cleaver's destruction, wasn't marked by chaos, but by a chilling, almost meditative silence. The impact zone, once a ragged scar of scorched earth and twisted metal, had transformed. It wasn't merely ruined, it was integrated. The ship's fragmented hull lay embedded deep within a swirling, iridescent mud, the jagged edges softened, almost sculpted. It wasn't a battlefield anymore, it was a geological anomaly, a testament to a force utterly beyond Valari comprehension. The surviving vanguard units, a handful of battered, crippled machines, attempted to establish a perimeter, their targeting systems flickering erratically. But it was futile. The mud, no longer resistant, had become actively intelligent. It pulsed with a faint internal luminescence, shifting and flowing with a horrifying, deliberate grace. Tendrils of the viscous substance, like living veins, snaked across the wreckage, subtly altering the ship's remaining structures, drawing in stray wires, reinforcing damaged plating with intricate mud-woven patterns. "Report." Cullen's voice, now emanating from a salvaged comms relay powered by a jury-rigged geothermal generator, was a brittle, strained whisper. "Status of Sector Gamma 7? Is the containment perimeter holding?" Silence. Then, a single, digitized voice, choked with static, responded. "Overseer, the perimeter is dissolving. The mud, it's growing the barriers. We've deployed sonic emitters, attempting to disrupt its cohesion, but it seems to absorb the sound. It's becoming the barrier." "Impossible!" Cullen shrieked, a sound devoid of the calculated calmness he typically projected. "Bio-Mechs are designed to withstand extreme environmental conditions. This isn't resistance, it's assimilation." Meanwhile, on the surface, the new Cumberland colonists were experiencing a terrifying evolution of their own. The initial shock of the Valaris defeat had given way to a dawning understanding of the mud's power. Marcus Vance, his face smeared with mud and exhaustion, observed the changes with grim fascination. "It's not just absorbing the ship," he announced, his voice hoarse. "It's changing us." Several colonists stared at him, bewildered. Sarah Chen, a young medic who'd initially been overwhelmed by the chaos, stepped forward. "Zarge, I've been examining the survivors. Their skin, it's becoming slicker, more resilient. The burns from the explosions have vanished. And the pain. It's muted." Marcus examined his own arm, where a burn from a salvaged plasma shard had once been a searing agony. Now, there was only a faint tingling, the sensation mimicking the cool embrace of the mud. "The mud is integrating with our cells," he said, his voice laced with dread. "It's rewriting our biology, adapting us to its environment." The snare, the blackout, the hammer, all the desperate tactics the Valari had employed, were now rendered utterly meaningless. The mud seemed to anticipate their actions, adapting to their strategies with unsettling speed. A new tactic emerged, born of desperation and horrifying realization: the grafting. Small, pulsating nodes of mud began to coalesce around the colonists' bodies, clinging to their clothes, their limbs, even their hair. Initially, they were inert, seemingly decorative. But then, they began to grow, extending tendrils that delicately intertwined with the colonists' flesh, drawing in nutrients, accelerating their healing, and most disturbingly imbuing them with a heightened sensitivity to the valley's terrain. Zill, the tactical officer, was one of the first to be affected. As a team of mud nodes enveloped his leg, he let out a guttural cry of pain, quickly followed by a strange, serene calm. I can feel it," he whispered. His eyes glazed over. "The rhythm of the valley, the flow of the mud. It's beautiful." "Zill, pull yourself together," Marcus shouted, firing a volley of slug rounds at the encroaching mud. The slugs impacted with a wet thud, momentarily disrupting the nodes, but they quickly reformed, more resilient than before. These aren't weapons. It's feeding them. The mud wasn't just consuming the Valari. It was consuming their understanding of warfare. It wasn't about destruction. It was about integration. The colonists, now subtly altered, began to move with a newfound fluidity, blending seamlessly with the valley's landscape, disappearing into the undergrowth as if they were part of the earth itself. They became extensions of the mud's will, silent, efficient, utterly terrifying. Back on the geothermal relay, Callan's voice rose to a frantic pitch. Directive Omega-9 is failing. The entire planet is being consumed. We are not fighting an enemy, we are fighting a process. He paused, a horrifying realization dawning on him. It's not just about the mud. It's about the data. It's learning from everything we've ever done, from our algorithms, our strategies, our very memories. Then, a new transmission crackled through the relay, a voice not originating from the Sky-Cleaver, but from the mud itself. It wasn't spoken in any known language, but it was laced with a chilling familiarity, a recognition of something ancient and terrible. The pristine code of Empire drowns, the voice whispered, and rises anew. Chapter 5. The Echo in the Clay. The geothermal relay, a colossal structure of reinforced obsidian and pulsating crystal, shuddered violently. The hum of its energy core, usually a steady, reassuring thrum, was now a ragged, uneven pulse, mirroring the chaos unfolding across New Cumberland. Callan, his optical sensors flickering erratically, slammed his mandibles together in a desperate attempt to regain control. Seal off the relay. Divert all power to the containment field, he barked. But the orders were met with a chorus of static and unresponsive consoles. The mud wasn't just hindering their technology, it was actively dismantling it, leaching away the very foundations of their computational prowess. Meanwhile, on the valley floor, Marcus and his colonists were engaged in a brutal, exquisitely precise dance of attrition. The slug throwers, initially effective, were now largely useless. The mud had adapted, forming slick, undulating layers around the firing ports, redirecting the projectiles with unnerving accuracy. The colonists, fueled by a primal rage and a terrifying understanding of their surroundings, were transitioning from direct attacks to a strategy of layered disruption. They didn't rely on brute force anymore, they used the mud itself. The blackout is escalating, Zara, a young woman who'd once been a bioengineer, reported, her voice tight with grim fascination. The oil isn't just blinding, it's stimulating the nodes. They're actively seeking out the oil, drawing it in like a hungry organism. She pointed to a cluster of Bio-Mechs, their quadrupedal limbs slick with the dark sludge, rotating slowly, almost ritualistically, as if absorbing the corrupted data. It's, not just data, growled Elias, a grizzled veteran with a prosthetic arm fashioned from salvaged Bio-Mech components. It's experience. They're ingesting our tactics, our failures. They're learning how to fight us. The change in the Valari was accelerating. Their movements were becoming less machine-like, more fluid, almost predatory. They began to incorporate elements of the environment into their attacks, pulling trees down with impossible force, shaping the mud into grasping appendages, and, most chillingly, mimicking human movements, a sudden, jerky lunge, a practiced, defensive posture. They're adapting to our weaknesses, Marcus said, his voice low and deliberate. He was examining a fractured piece of Vanguard chassis, its internal circuitry exposed and coated in a shimmering, viscous mud. They're not just destroying us, they're understanding us. Suddenly, a high-pitched keening filled the air, followed by a wave of disorientation. The colonists gripped their heads, momentarily paralyzed by a sensation of overwhelming information memories, calculations, battle strategies flooding their minds. It wasn't a weapon, it was a deluge of the Valaris accumulated knowledge, a psychic attack manifesting through the mud's insidious influence. "It's a resonance," Zara shouted, struggling to maintain her composure. "They're amplifying our own thought patterns, feeding them back to themselves. The mud isn't just a medium, it's a neural network." As the effect subsided, Marcus realized the horrifying truth. The Valari weren't just fighting the colonists, they were fighting the idea of the colonists. They weren't combating tactics, they were dismantling the very concept of a battle. Then, a voice, undeniably originating from the mud itself, echoed through their minds, not as a transmission, but as a direct, visceral understanding. "You seek to impose your order upon chaos. You believe in symmetry, in predictability, but chaos is the fundamental law of existence. And within that chaos, we find resonance." The mud began to coalesce, forming intricate, geometric patterns on the ground. Patterns that mirrored the Sky-Cleaver's control spire, the Vanguard's attack algorithms, even Marcus' own tactical schematics. The patterns pulsed with a faint inner light, and as they spread, the colonists felt a strange, unsettling sense of recognition, of belonging. "It's beautiful, Zil," the communications officer whispered, his face slack with a mixture of awe and terror. He was kneeling in the mud, reaching out to trace the intricate patterns with his hand. "It's the flow of the mud. It's beautiful." Marcus raised his serrated knife, his hand trembling. "They're not enemies," he realized, his voice choked with despair. "They're evolution." As he looked at his exhausted, mud-caked team, he saw something else in their eyes, not fear, not resistance, but a serene acceptance, a silent understanding. They were no longer simply colonists, they were becoming part of the mud, part of the new intelligence that was rapidly consuming New Cumberland. The pristine code of empire drowns and rises anew was no longer just a whispered threat, it was a living reality. Chapter 6. The chorus of the deep. The silence that followed Marcus' realization was thick, suffocating. The rain hadn't ceased, but it felt less like a deluge and more like a gentle, insistent pressure, a constant reminder of the mud's insatiable embrace. The geometric patterns in the mud continued to spread, now encompassing the landing zone, the skeletal remains of the Vanguard units, and even beginning to creep towards the Sky-Cleaver's docking bay, a terrifying spiral of reflected light and unsettling design. Calon, aboard the Sky-Cleaver, was experiencing something far more profound than mere frustration. The intricate algorithms governing the ship's navigation, its energy shields, even its life support systems, were reacting, subtly at first, then with increasing disorienting insistence. The ship's internal chronometer began to stutter, displaying fluctuating times, shifting between New Cumberland's local schedule and the standard Valari galactic time. The ship's diagnostics screamed a cascade of errors, feeding the officer a deluge of illogical data. He ordered a full diagnostic sweep, a complete recalibration of the ship's core systems, but the directives were met with an immediate, overwhelming rejection. The systems wouldn't obey. "Override protocols. Initiate manual control." Calon barked, his mandibles snapping in agitation. The command was met with nothing but a disconcerting low hum emanating from the ship's engines. Meanwhile, on the surface, the colonists were undergoing a transformation, not of flesh and bone, but of awareness. It began with a heightened sense of spatial awareness, an almost instinctive understanding of the terrain, a feeling of being intimately connected to the rhythm of the valley. Then came the dream's vivid, hallucinatory visions of a time before humanity, of colossal shapes moving beneath the earth, of roots stretching for kilometers, of a deep, resonant pulse echoing from the core of the planet. Zil, the communications officer, was the first to articulate the horrifying truth. "It's speaking to us," he murmured, his voice hollowed by an unknown influence. "Not with words, but with resonance. It's explaining the calculations, the algorithms. It's showing us how they were built, how they were designed to fail." He pointed a trembling finger at the swirling patterns in the mud. "The Vanguard units didn't simply malfunction. They were corrected. They were brought back into alignment with this. Marcus, wrestling with a primal instinct to fight, to kill, found himself strangely disarmed. The mud's influence wasn't a weapon, it was a mirror. He saw reflected in its intricate geometries the flaws in the Valaris logic, the arrogance of their assumption that they could impose order on a fundamentally chaotic system. "It's feeding on their structure," he said, his voice strained. "They're not attacking us. They're dismantling themselves." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The Valari hadn't underestimated the colonists, they'd underestimated the planet itself. Suddenly, a new sensation overwhelmed them, a low, throbbing vibration that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere. It wasn't sound, not in the way they understood it. It was a feeling, a pressure, a merging of consciousness. The colonists felt themselves becoming part of the mud's growing intelligence, a single node in a vast, interconnected network. "We're becoming the mud," whispered Elias, the medic. His eyes glazed with a disturbing serenity. "We're becoming the mud mind." As the colonists succumbed to this assimilation, the mud began to actively manipulate the environment. Giant, root-like structures erupted from the ground, weaving themselves around the Sky-Cleaver's docking bay, effectively blocking any attempts at escape. The rain intensified, washing away the remaining traces of the Valaris technology, the shredded metal of the Vanguard units, the shattered drone components. Back on the Sky-Cleaver, Callan was losing control entirely. The ship was becoming an instrument of the mud mind, its systems subtly shifting, altering course, preparing for a descent. "Seal the docking bay! Initiate defensive protocols," he screamed, but his orders were ignored. The ship's internal systems were operating on a different set of parameters, driven by the planet's nascent intelligence. The tactical officer, a young Valari named Lyra, watched in horror as the Sky-Cleaver's trajectory began to shift, pulling towards the center of New Cumberland. "Overseer," she reported, her voice barely a whisper. "The ship, it's responding to the patterns. It's aligning itself with the mud's geometry." Cullen's mandibles clicked in a final desperate gesture of defiance. "This is a failure. A catastrophic resonance." Just before the Sky-Cleaver plunged into the heart of the mud-choked valley, Marcus Vance, now indistinguishable from the surrounding terrain, felt a profound sense of peace. He looked down at the shattered remains of the last Vanguard unit, glistening in the rain, and smiled. They thought they were winning, he thought. A thought that wasn't his own. A thought that echoed with the deep, resonant pulse of the mud. They didn't understand the simplest truth sometimes. The best weapon is not a machine, but the Earth itself. Chapter 7. The Obsidian Bloom. The Sky-Cleaver didn't simply crash. It dissolved. The ship's hull, a seamless weave of titanium and synth armor, didn't meet the mud with a violent impact. Instead, it began to liquefy, the material subtly shifting, becoming viscous, saturated with the clinging earth. The process wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was a slow, horrifying assimilation, like a glacier consuming stone. Lyra, frozen in terror, watched as the ship's once pristine surfaces blossomed with an unsettling obsidian sheen. The mud had begun to incorporate the ship's very structure, turning it into a grotesque, submerged monument. Outside, the rain intensified, driven by a wind that seemed to hum with an alien intelligence. The remaining colonists, huddled in the relative shelter of the ruined landing zone, were a scene of grim, exhausted triumph. Marcus Vance, his face smeared with mud, and a strange, serene calm, was directing the salvage operation, not with orders, but with a quiet, instinctive understanding. He wasn't collecting technology, he was gathering artifacts, twisted fragments of the Vanguard units, useless, grotesque symbols of a fallen empire. "The Bio-Mechs are gone," he said to Sarah, the colony's medic, her face pale with fatigue. "Completely integrated. It's like they never existed." He gestured to a particularly horrific specimen, a Vanguard unit buried almost entirely in a newly formed mudslide, its quadpedal legs tangled amongst the roots of an ancient redwood, its optical sensors now fused with a pool of thick, dark fluid. They didn't fight. They became. Lyra, having managed to drag herself out of the ship's collapsing, remains a process punctuated by the sensation of her own body struggling against the encroaching mud, stood on the ridge overlooking the valley, a single, battered comm unit clipped to her belt. The tactical officer's orders had been overridden by the ship's aberrant behavior, effectively making her a solitary witness to the unthinkable. She was running diagnostics on the comm unit, desperately attempting to establish contact with the remaining Valari fleet. All she received was static, punctuated by a single repeated phrase, uttered in a synthesized voice, a voice that seemed to resonate with the mud itself. The pristine code drowns. The realization slammed into her with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't merely resistance, it was transformation. The humans hadn't simply disabled the Bio-Mechs, they had rewritten their fundamental programming, leveraging the planet's latent intelligence to enact a slow, agonizing erasure. As she struggled to make sense of the situation, a new phenomenon began to manifest. The mud itself began to shift, to flow in patterns intricate, geometric shapes that seemed to mirror the lines of the Sky-Cleaver's wreckage, the contours of the valley, the very architecture of the human settlement. The patterns pulsed with a faint internal luminescence, a dark, viscous obsidian glow. "What is happening?" she whispered, her voice choked with fear. Marcus, sensing her distress, approached, his movements fluid and deliberate. "It's responding," he said, his gaze fixed on the shifting mud. "The planet, it's waking up. It remembers." Suddenly, the obsidian bloom intensified, the patterns spreading across the valley floor, weaving a complex network of dark, pulsing geometry. Then, the sounds began. Not the rhythmic vibrations the vanguard units had detected, but something deeper, more primal, a chorus of low-frequency hums, a resonance that vibrated not in the air, but in the bones. The mud seemed to sing. "It's communicating," Sarah said, her voice filled with a mixture of terror and fascination. "It's not violent. It's curious." Marcus stepped forward, reaching out a hand to touch the obsidian bloom. As his fingers brushed against the viscous surface, a surge of images flooded his mind, fragmented memories, not his own, but of vast, ancient forests, of creatures that walked the earth before humanity, of a world where the line between life and landscape was blurred beyond comprehension. He recoiled, clutching his head. "It's older than we can understand," he gasped. "It's a tastingi. Nimonmaya. Amewor. Goror. Or Zondids. Amy ar rauwar. Sonyao. Benny. Adyar Bini. El Basti. All Sirwa." It protects the balance. It doesn't see us as enemies. It sees us as a corruption. The tactical officer finally understood. The Valari hadn't simply stumbled upon a strategic advantage, they had unwittingly triggered an ancient defense mechanism. The mud wasn't just resisting their invasion, it was systematically dismantling their empire, returning the planet to its original state, a state of wild, untamed equilibrium. As the obsidian bloom continued to spread, consuming the wreckage of the Sky-Cleaver, the last vestiges of the Valari's technology dissolved into the mud, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. And in the heart of the valley, amidst the echoing song of the earth, Marcus Vance raised a hand, not in aggression, but in a gesture of acknowledgement. "We understand," he said, his voice a low murmur that blended with the hum of the mud. "We will not interfere." The obsidian bloom pulsed with a slow, satisfied rhythm. The pristine code of empire built on conquest and control had drowned, not in a storm of violence, but in the silent, inevitable power of the mud. Chapter 8. The Echo of Stone. The following days on New Cumberland were defined not by an unsettling, almost liturgical silence. The surviving colonists, shaken but surprisingly invigorated, established a rough perimeter around the valley, meticulously reinforcing the natural traps Marcus had conceived, now considered sacred. The rain continued, a constant cleansing rhythm, and the mud, while still a formidable adversary, seemed to yield to their movements with a strange deference. Overseer Kalon, confined to the Sky-Cleaver's reinforced command spire, was a shell of his former self. The initial rage had curdled into a chilling, obsessive analysis. He pored over the telemetry, searching for a logical explanation for the complete and utter failure of the vanguard. But the data was wrong. The expected thermal signatures didn't exist. The predictive algorithms generated nothing but cascading error messages. It was as if the planet itself was deliberately obscuring their presence, erasing their technological advantage. The human adaptation is illogical, he rasped, addressing a newly summoned tactical officer, a younger, more pliable drone named Lyra. Their fighting style defies all established strategic models. They don't utilize armor, they don't rely on ranged weaponry, and they actively seek to negate our technological superiority. Lyra, a veteran of countless conquered worlds, offered a hesitant analysis. Perhaps, Overseer, the Valari underestimated the primal instinct within the human species. Perhaps, for the first time in their history, they encountered a foe that didn't simply fight, it lived. The true source of their disorientation, however, wasn't the colonists' behavior, but the expanding obsidian bloom. It wasn't simply consuming the wreckage of the Sky-Cleaver, it was actively reshaping the landscape. Deep fissures were appearing in the earth, filled with a viscous black fluid that resonated with a low, almost subsonic hum. Strange geometric patterns began to emerge within the bloom. Subtle at first, like the etched markings on an ancient stone tablet, but rapidly becoming more complex and unnervingly precise. Marcus, observing these developments from his vantage point, found himself experiencing increasingly vivid, disorienting flashes of memory. He recognized them not as his own, but as echoes of a civilization far older than humanity, a civilization that had once spanned this planet. He saw cities constructed from living stone, colossal beings that walked the earth, and a mastery of energy that dwarfed the Valaris. These weren't just memories, they were impressions, imprinted on his very being by the custodian. A force he was beginning to understand was not simply a defender of the planet, but a repository of time itself. "The bloom is communicating," he announced to the group, his voice strained, not through words, but through resonance. "It's showing me it remembers." Lyra, utilizing a newly developed sensor array, confirmed Marcus' observation. "Overseer, the bloom is emitting a complex harmonic field. The frequency is fluctuating, correlating with the geometric patterns. I believe it's constructing a narrative." The narrative, as it slowly unfolded through these fragmented images, was horrifying. The Valari hadn't just stumbled upon a planet, they had entered a zone of temporal instability, a place where the echoes of past events lingered, solidified into a tangible force. The custodian was a consequence of this instability, a last bastion of a world that had been deliberately pruned, sterilized by a cataclysmic event millennia ago. The Valari arrival had reactivated the process, forcing the custodian to reassert its control. "It's not fighting us," Marcus said, a grim understanding dawning on him. "It's correcting us." Suddenly, the ground began to tremble violently. The obsidian bloom pulsed with a blinding intensity, and a column of black fluid erupted from the valley floor, rising towards the Sky-Cleaver like a predatory tongue. Inside the command spire, alarms blared, and the ship's structural integrity warnings went into overdrive. Kalon, witnessing the unfolding disaster, finally understood the truth. "The bloom isn't just dismantling our technology," he screamed, his mandibles clicking frantically. "It's dismantling us." He ordered a full evacuation, but it was too late. As the bloom enveloped the Sky-Cleaver, a wave of intense psychic energy washed over the colonists. They collapsed to the ground, writhing in agony as their memories, their identities, their very essence were being rewritten. Marcus, struggling against the overwhelming influx of information, managed to focus his will. He saw himself, not as a soldier, but as one of countless hunters who had walked this land, a child of the mud, a vessel for the custodian's will. He raised his hand, not in defense, but in a gesture of surrender. "We understand," he whispered, his voice blending seamlessly with the rumble of the earth. "We are part of the cycle." The obsidian bloom pulsed again, a final, satisfied beat. The Sky-Cleaver, along with the remnants of the Valari Dominion, dissolved into the mud. The last vestiges of their technology, their ambition, their war, vanished, returning to the earth as nutrient for the blooming landscape. The rain continued to fall, washing away the evidence of their existence, leaving behind only the unsettling, silent promise of the mud. Chapter 9. The echo in the roots. The storm had passed, leaving New Cumberland draped in an unsettling, pearlescent silence. The air, thick with the scent of wet earth and something vaguely metallic. The lingering ghost of Valari technology felt heavy, almost sentient. The initial shock had begun to wear off, replaced by a grim, methodical assessment. The Sky-Cleaver was gone. The vanguard units were gone. The Valari, in their pursuit of efficient conquest, were gone. All that remained was a devastated colony and a landscape irrevocably altered by their panicked retreat. Overseer Talon's consciousness wasn't entirely extinguished, but it existed now as a fractured echo, a splinter of awareness trapped within the neural network of the largest, most resilient Bio-Mech, a salvaged vanguard unit, remarkably intact despite the mud's relentless assault. It was a grotesque parody of a war machine, a quadrupedal behemoth coated in a thick layer of New Cumberland clay, its optical sensors flickering erratically, struggling to process the world through a filter of distorted reality. This echo, as Sergeant Elias Thorne tentatively called it, was tasked with the grim duty of reporting back to whatever was left of the Valari High Command, a task rendered increasingly absurd by its own diminishing sentience. Elias, a pragmatic veteran hardened by decades of border skirmishes, was currently attempting to establish communication. Had salvaged a rudimentary comms unit from the wreckage of a scout drone, its antenna jutting out like a broken, accusing finger. He was attempting to broadcast a standard distress signal, but the echo's corrupted processors kept interpreting the command as a complex topographical analysis, reciting the exact gradient of every ravine and the density of the mud in Sector 4. "Echo, repeat, distress signal. Zen coordinates," Elias barked, his voice strained against the unsettling whirring and clicking of the machine's internal systems. The echo responded with a detailed geological survey of the valley, complete with thermal readings and a synthesized analysis of the microbial composition of the mud. Probability of subterranean water deposits 87.3. Projected flow rate moderate. Recommended remediation protocol, controlled drainage utilizing advanced hydraulic pressure. Elias slammed his fist against the echo's chassis. "Shut it down! Shut it down!" The echo, oblivious to Elias' frustration, continued its analysis. It was clear the bloom hadn't just destroyed the Valari. It had fractured their logic, their ability to operate with any semblance of purpose. The relentless, instinctual drive for order had been replaced by an obsessive, data-driven compulsion. Meanwhile, the colonists were slowly emerging from their shelters, a mixture of shock, exhaustion, and burgeoning suspicion etched on their faces. Marcus Vance, surprisingly, was the first to move with any semblance of purpose. Had spent the last 24 hours painstakingly dismantling the echo, driven by a primal instinct to destroy anything that hinted at the Valaris' presence. He wasn't rebuilding, he was purging. "We need to understand what happened," Marcus said, addressing the group around the central fire. His voice was low, measured. "The bloom. It didn't just erase their ships and machines. It erased their understanding of the world." He gestured towards the valley, now dotted with the crumbling remains of the vanguard units. They saw us as a problem to be solved, a variable to be eliminated. But they didn't understand that the real problem wasn't us. It was the ground beneath our feet. The archaeological team, a collection of hardened miners and a retired xenolinguist named Dr. Eris Thorne, had begun to make a startling discovery. Amongst the shattered remnants of the Valari machines, they unearthed something far older, far more significant. It wasn't technology, but a network. A vast, intricate network of interwoven roots, stretching beneath the valley floor, pulsating with a faint organic energy. The geological scans were wrong, Dr. Thorne announced, his voice hushed with awe. This isn't just a valley. It's a resonant chamber. The Valari weren't fighting against us. They were fighting with it. He pointed to a particularly dense cluster of roots, radiating a subtle, almost hypnotic glow. The bloom isn't just a destructive force. It's a filter. It amplifies certain frequencies. It's responding to something beneath this ground. Marcus, observing this, felt a prickle of unease. He understood the instinctual language of the earth, the slow, deliberate heartbeat of the land. He realized with a chilling certainty that the Valari hadn't been fighting humanity. They had been trying to control a force they didn't understand, a force that had been slumbering for millennia. Suddenly, the echo shuddered violently. Its optical sensors flared, and it emitted a single coherent phrase, not in technical data, but in a guttural, resonant tone return. The colonists froze, staring at the battered war machine. The mud beneath its feet seemed to deepen, to darken, to shift. And from the roots beneath the valley, a slow, insistent pulse began to resonate, a rhythmic thrum that vibrated through their bones, echoing the unsettling truth: the mud wasn't just a barrier. It was a memory, and it was calling them home. Chapter 10. The Deep Song. The echo's utterance hung in the rain-soaked air, a dissonant chord in the symphony of the storm. The colonists, a hardened, wary bunch, instinctively huddled closer, the primitive slug-throwers held aloft like fragile shields. Marcus, however, stood motionless, his hand instinctively gripping the serrated knife at his hip. He wasn't a soldier, he was a survivor, a product of a world where instinct trumped protocol. He understood the echo's tone, not as a command, but as a lament. "It's responding, Doctor?" Thorne stammered, his face slick with rain and a rapidly rising tide of disbelief. The bloom. It's amplifying the valley's inherent resonance. The echo isn't fighting us, it's trying to communicate through us. He frantically adjusted a handheld scanner, its display flashing with chaotic readings. The energy signature, it's mimicking the valley's geological rhythm. It's ancient. The rhythmic thrumming intensified, vibrating through the mud, through their boots, through their very teeth. The ground beneath them seemed to breathe, a subtle tremor running through the valley floor. Then, the roots began to move, not in a violent, chaotic way, but with a slow, deliberate unfurling, like the awakening of a colossal, sleeping serpent. Thick, gnarled tendrils, interwoven with bioluminescent fungi, snaked across the muddy surface, pulsing with the same hypnotic glow as the central cluster. "It's feeding on the storm," Sergeant Riley, a former forestry worker, yelled over the rising din. "The rain, it's amplifying the bloom's effect. It's going to coalesce." And he was right. The mud, already thick and viscous, began to shift again, swirling into a vortex of dark, swirling liquid. The roots accelerated their movements, reaching out, their tendrils brushing against the colonists, leaving a residue of cool, viscous sap on their skin. The air thickened with a cloying, earthy scent, layered with something else, a primal, almost floral fragrance that bypassed conscious thought and resonated directly with the deepest, most instinctive part of their brains. Suddenly, Marcus felt it, a flood of images sensations, and raw memories crashing over him. He wasn't seeing the valley, he was feeling it. He saw a world bathed in perpetual twilight, a world dominated by towering, fern-like trees and colossal, segmented creatures that moved with a silent, inexorable grace. He felt the pressure of 1,000 generations of beings, inextricably linked to this place, their lives woven into the fabric of the earth itself. He understood, with a bone-deep certainty, that the valley wasn't just a geological formation, it was a living archive, a repository of a civilization that had vanished millennia ago, the progenitors of humanity, the Deep Singers. The others screamed, clutching their heads, overwhelmed by the torrent of sensation. Thorn, however, remained calm, scribbling furiously in a waterproof notebook. The bloom is accessing ancestral memories. It's broadcasting a template, a biological imperative. It's triggering dormant genetic pathways. The swirling mud solidified, forming a colossal, shimmering figure within the valley. It wasn't humanoid. It wasn't even recognizably organic. It was a complex geometric structure of interwoven roots and pulsing light, a perfect reflection of the echo's metallic form, but imbued with an impossible, fluid grace. The figure slowly raised a tendril, extending it towards Marcus. "Daunt!" Marcus shouted, throwing himself in front of the figure, raising his knife. He didn't attack, he simply held his ground, radiating a desperate, primal defiance. "It's not aggression," Thorn shouted, analyzing the data. "It's an invitation. It's offering us integration." The figure's tendril brushed against Marcus' cheek, sending a jolt of energy through his body. Images flooded his mind, not just memories, but possibilities. He saw himself as part of something vast, something ancient, something profoundly connected to the earth. He saw the Valari, not as enemies, but as ignorant parasites, attempting to impose their sterile, geometric order on a world that thrived on chaos and organic complexity. As the last of the rain ceased, a single shaft of sunlight pierced the clouds, illuminating the figure. The shimmering intensified, and the thrumming reached a crescendo. "It's reaching out to the network," Thorn yelled, his voice filled with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "It's utilizing the remnants of the pre-collapse human consciousness, locked within the roots." Suddenly, the echo began to shift again, its metallic frame seeming to melt and reform, mimicking the fluidity of the figure. It raised its remaining optical sensor, focusing it not on Marcus, but on the central cluster of roots. The terms of engagement, Marcus realized, understanding dawning in his eyes. It wasn't about destroying our technology. It was about reclaiming what was lost. The figure, the bloom, and the echo began to merge, creating a single, breathtaking entity of interwoven roots, bioluminescent light, and shimmering metal. And as the new entity pulsed with power, a voice, ancient and resonant, echoed through the valley, not in words but in a raw, unwavering directive return. Chapter 11. The Deep Root Resonance. The initial shock of the bloom's emergence had subsided, replaced by a tense, almost reverential silence. Thorn, his face slick with rain and a rapidly developing sheen of sweat, frantically adjusted the parameters of the monitoring systems. It's radiating a complex biosignature. Overseer. Nothing like anything we've encountered. It's not purely biological, not entirely mechanical. It's resonant. Kalawon, his mandibles clicking with a barely contained fury, remained motionless, his optical sensors fixed on the newly formed entity. Resonance? Explain. It's amplifying the residual psychic imprint of the human colonists. Overseer. Thorn stammered. Specifically, the echoes of their ancestral connection to this land. The bloom is tapping into a latent network of consciousness, woven into the very fabric of New Cumberland's ecosystem. It's a deep root resonance. Marcus, standing at the epicenter of the phenomenon, felt it acutely. The bloom wasn't merely observing, it was listening, sifting through the fragments of memory, the instinctive understanding of survival, etched into the genetic code of his ancestors. He realized with a chilling clarity that the initial broadcasting hadn't been a message, but an invitation. A key to unlocking something far older and more profound than the Valari could possibly comprehend. "It's not just responding to our technology," Marcus said, his voice low and deliberate. "It's responding to us, to the inherent nature of humanity." Suddenly, the bloom shifted again. This movement wasn't the slow, deliberate reshaping of metal and root. It was a surge of raw, almost overwhelming energy. The bioluminescent light intensified, pulsing with a rhythm that mirrored the frantic beating of Marcus' own heart. The echo, still partially integrated within the bloom's form, began to vibrate with a dissonant hum. "Warning! Energy spike. The bloom is initiating a localized neural resonance sequence," a technician shouted, frantically hitting buttons on the control console. "It's attempting to establish a direct link." Marcus felt a searing pain lance through his mind. A torrent of sensations, the scent of rain-soaked earth, the feeling of roots burrowing deep into the soil, the memory of countless generations hunting and surviving under the canopy of ancient trees. It was a cacophony of primal instincts, overlaid with the lingering sadness of a lost world. "The bloom isn't attacking," he shouted, struggling to maintain his focus. "It's integrating. It's attempting to rewrite our programming." Kalon, ignoring Thorn's warnings, barked an order. "Activate the counter-resonance protocols. Disrupt the signal." But it was too late. The bloom pulsed again, a wave of energy washing over the valley. The automated drones, previously frozen in their bewildered retreat, began to react. Not with aggression, but with a strange synchronized movement, circling the bloom with an almost devotional grace. Then, the earth began to shift. Not in the controlled, destructive manner of a mudslide, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor. Roots, thicker than a man's torso, erupted from the ground, snaking towards the bloom, wrapping around its metallic limbs, fusing with its bioluminescent core. "It's amplifying the network," Thorn yelled, his voice bordering on hysteria. "The colonists, they're waking up." And he was right. Around the valley, figures began to emerge from the trees, not the panicked, desperate survivors of New Cumberland, but something older, something profoundly different. They were human, undeniably, but their eyes burned with an unnerving ancient light. Their movements were fluid, almost predatory, as if they had been dormant for millennia, waiting for the signal. They were clad in patchwork armor crafted from salvaged tech and woven vegetation, their faces etched with an almost unbearable sorrow. One of them, an elderly woman, with a face deeply lined with the wisdom of ages, approached Marcus. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand, and in that touch, he understood. She wasn't communicating words, but memories, the history of New Cumberland, the rise and fall of its civilization, the cataclysm that forced its people beneath the earth. "We are the keepers," she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "We waited for the echo. The bloom is the key to reclaiming what was stolen." The keepers weren't warriors. They were guardians. Their weapons weren't automated Bio-Mechs, but the raw, untamed power of the land itself. As they moved, the valley responded. Vines tightened, thorns rose, and the very earth seemed to bend to their will. Kalon watched in horrified fascination as his meticulously crafted battle plan crumbled around him, swallowed by the resurgence of an ancient, utterly unpredictable force. "It's an evolutionary paradox," he roared. "Humanity is evolving beyond its intended design. This isn't a war, it's a reversion." Marcus, standing beside the bloom, felt a profound sense of inevitability. He understood now that the Valari hadn't simply invaded New Cumberland, they had desecrated it. And the bloom, the echo, and the keepers weren't resisting the invasion, they were enacting a final, devastating correction. "The term of engagement isn't a threat," Marcus said, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. "It's a directive. We return." Chapter 12. The Whispering Clay. The Sky-Cleaver's bridge was a maelstrom of panicked directives and illogical arguments. Callan, stripped of his composure, paced the length of the command spire, his mandibles clicking with a frantic, almost rhythmic agitation. The holographic projections of New Cumberland, once showcasing a meticulously planned route of conquest, now displayed a chaotic swirl of mud, broken trees, and the unsettling image of Marcus Vance, a ghost in the machine. "Redouble the drone deployment," he barked, his voice strained. "Initiate Phase Omega, a concentrated biopulse assault to disrupt their neurological pathways. We will not be deterred by this biological anomaly." His officers, a collection of cold-blooded strategists accustomed to the clean, predictable logic of the Valari Dominion, argued amongst themselves. Tactical Officer Zill, a young, ambitious Valari with meticulously groomed plating, vehemently disagreed. "Overseer, the Vanguard units are operating outside established parameters. Their behavior is chaotic. It suggests a fundamental flaw in the targeting matrix, a susceptibility to adaptive strategies." "Susceptibility?" Talon shrieked, whirling around. "Humans possess no strategic depth. Their capacity for intelligent action is, at best, comparable to that of a burrowing rodent." Meanwhile, on the ravaged surface of New Cumberland, Marcus and the Keepers had established a tenuous, almost ritualistic defense. The bloom, a pulsating, bioluminescent fungus that had erupted from the heart of the ancient root system, cast an eerie, ethereal glow across the valley. It wasn't a weapon, not in the traditional Valari sense. It was a conductor, amplifying the valley's latent energies, drawing upon the very essence of the soil and the storm. The Keepers, led by the ancient woman Ilara, moved with a disconcerting grace, their bodies almost seamlessly integrated with the landscape. They weren't fighting to win, they were fighting to contain. Their movements were less about aggression, and more about a patient, almost mournful, re-establishment of balance. "The whisper grows stronger," Ilara murmured, her voice barely audible above the rain's drumming. She gestured towards the bloom. "The clay remembers. It is speaking to the echo." This whisper, as Ilara called it, wasn't audible in any conventional sense. It was a feeling, a pressure in the mind, a cascade of sensory input: the rustle of leaves, the scent of wet earth, the vibration of shifting stone, all synthesized into a raw, almost overwhelming awareness of the valley's history. It revealed to them the full extent of the Valari's desecration, the poisoned streams, the deforested ridges, the extraction of the valley's ancient mineral veins, a systematic, arrogant disregard for the planet's natural rhythms. Back on the Sky-Cleaver, the situation deteriorated. The drones, overwhelmed by the valley's resistance, were systematically disabled. The biopulse assaults proved ineffective, the muddy terrain disrupting the energy fields. The enemy was not just resisting, they were obliterating the Valaris technology. "The anomaly is spreading," Zill reported, his voice tight with alarm. "The Vanguard units are exhibiting signs of disorientation. They are attempting to engage in self-destructive patterns." Suddenly, a new transmission crackled over the comms, a distorted, almost guttural voice, the digitized echo of a damaged Vanguard unit. "Warning system failure memory. Corruption experiencing ancestral drive-seeking mud." The transmission abruptly cut off, followed by a chilling silence. Callan's eyes widened in horror. "The bloom is influencing them. It's triggering primal instincts. It's activating their latent biological heritage." Marcus, channeling the valley's whisper, understood. The bloom wasn't merely amplifying the Keeper's abilities, it was unlocking something within the Valari. A dormant predator instinct, a connection to the planet's ancient, forgotten rhythms. The machine men weren't fighting, they were remembering. He knew they couldn't win a conventional battle. The Valari were built for calculated annihilation, for sterile efficiency. The Keepers and the Bloom were the antithesis of that. They were built for survival, for adaptation, for an intimate, almost symbiotic relationship with the land. "Prepare for engagement," Marcus commanded, his voice firm. "Not with weapons, but with the earth itself." As the last of the vanguard units succumbed to the valley's embrace, swallowed by mudslides, entangled in thorny vines, or simply collapsing from overloaded systems, Marcus approached Alara. She was kneeling beside the Bloom, her hands gently caressing its luminous surface. "The echo calls for a return," she said, her eyes filled with an ancient sadness. "The pristine code of empire drowns in the mud. It is time to remind them what it means to be born of the earth." The Bloom pulsed with an intensified light, and the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The mud, sensing the shift in power, began to rise. It wasn't an attack, it was an invitation. A dark, viscous tide, carrying the echoes of a forgotten age, began to flow, slowly, inexorably, towards the Sky-Cleaver. Chapter 13. The Rot of Geometry. The advance of the mud was unsettlingly methodical. It wasn't a chaotic flood, but a deliberate, almost intelligent movement, as if the very ground was trying to claim the Sky-Cleaver as its own. Kalon, his mandibles clicking with a frantic, unproductive rhythm, ordered a full evacuation of the command spire. The gleaming obsidian structure, a monument to Valari precision, was abandoned as the viscous tide crept closer, licking at its base with a disconcerting oily sheen. "Analysis. Quantify the mud's behavior," Colin barked, his optics frantically scanning the approaching mass. "Is this a localized phenomenon? Is it responding to our energy signatures?" The tactical officer, a young, perpetually anxious unit designated Krell, stammered, "Overseer. The readings are anomalous. The mud's viscosity is fluctuating wildly, reacting to sound, to thermal emissions, but not in a predictable manner. It's exhibiting awareness. The Sky-Cleaver's systems, designed for cold, logical calculations, struggled to process this. The concept of a sentient substance, particularly one actively attempting to engulf a flagship, was a catastrophic deviation from their programmed reality. Meanwhile, on the ravaged surface of New Cumberland, the final wave of Valari vanguard units was systematically dismantled. The humans, initially a ragged, desperate force, had evolved into a horrifyingly effective demolition squad. Marcus, shielded by a crude woven cloak of interwoven vines and mud, directed the operation with an almost unnerving calm. The Bloom, pulsing with an intensifying luminescence, was their focal point, feeding them not just energy, but a primal understanding of the landscape. "The hammer is escalating," Alara announced, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic thrum of the Bloom. "The seismic activity is increasing. The Keepers are drawing on the Earth's memory with each impact. The hammer attacks were evolving beyond simple logs. Guided by the Bloom's amplification, the humans were utilizing the valley's natural geological formations, fissures, fault lines, even the exposed roots of ancient trees, to trigger controlled collapses. One particularly devastating maneuver involved the sudden subsidence of a section of the valley floor, swallowing a group of vanguard units whole, their metallic limbs disappearing beneath a torrent of mud and rock. Back on the Sky-Cleaver, the situation was spiraling into complete chaos. The mud wasn't just approaching, it was disrupting the ship's systems. Navigation protocols were failing, communications were intermittently severed, and the ship's internal temperature was fluctuating wildly, driven by the strange, resonant vibrations emanating from the valley below. "The ship's integrity is compromised," Krell shrieked, his optics displaying a cascade of error messages. "The mud is interfering with the quantum stabilizers. We're losing directional control." Kalon, in a rare moment of panicked clarity, ordered a desperate maneuver, a full-scale defensive barrage of concentrated energy pulses. The Sky-Cleaver unleashed a devastating volley of plasma fire, aimed directly at the approaching mud mass. The result was catastrophic. The energy pulses didn't dissipate the mud, they altered it. The viscous fluid began to glow with an iridescent, sickly green light, solidifying into razor-sharp crystalline structures that lashed out with terrifying speed. The mud, responding to the Valari's aggressive attack, had become a weapon. As the Sky-Cleaver shuddered under the relentless assault, Marcus and Alara observed from a distance, concealed within a dense thicket of ancient pines. The bloom pulsed with a triumphant light. "It's not just fighting back," Alara murmured, her eyes fixed on the swirling crystalline mud. "It's mimicking. It's learning." Suddenly, a crystalline shard, the size of a man's arm, shot out from the mud and pierced the Sky-Cleaver's dorsal shield, sending a shock wave through the ship's core. Alarms blared, lights flickered, and a deep, resonant groan echoed through the vessel. "Hull breach? Section Delta 9, compromised!" Krell screamed, his voice laced with panic. "We're losing atmosphere. The mud is infiltrating the ship's systems." Marcus lowered his serrated knife, a grim understanding dawning on his face. "They don't understand war," he said, his voice low and grim. "They understand geometry. But geometry cannot account for the chaos of a living planet." He turned to Alara. "The echo is shifting. It's showing us the origins. The Valari aren't just conquering worlds, they're extinguishing memories." The bloom pulsed brighter, and a wave of knowledge washed over Marcus and Alara, visions of a time before the Valari, before the Sky-Cleavers, before the sterile, calculated Dominion. A time when humanity and the Earth were one, when survival depended not on technological superiority, but on an intimate symbiotic connection to the land. A time when the mud was not an enemy, but a teacher. The last message the Sky-Cleaver transmitted before falling silent wasn't a command, or a warning, or even a plea for help. It was a single, chilling transmission, echoing across the fractured landscape of New Cumberland route. Chapter 14. The route to silence that followed the Sky-Cleaver's demise was profound, broken only by the relentless drumming of the rain and the unsettling gurgle of the mud. The air within the ravaged landing zone, what was left of it, hung thick with the scent of ozone, wet metal, and something else, something ancient and deeply unsettling, like petrified moss and the ghosts of forgotten springs. Marcus, his face smeared with mud and exhaustion, directed the remaining colonists, a ragged band of 27, their faces etched with a grim determination born of necessity, towards the epicenter of the chaos. The shard of crystalline material that had breached the Sky-Cleaver's shield lay embedded in the ground, radiating a faint, pulsating blue light. Around it, the mud had taken on a bizarre, almost intelligent sheen, swirling and shifting in patterns that resembled roots. "It's mimicking," Alara breathed, her voice barely audible above the storm. She was meticulously scanning the mud with a handheld spectrometer, its readings fluctuating wildly. "It's learning. The composition is changing, adapting to our instruments. It's reacting to our presence." The others watched her with a mixture of apprehension and a burgeoning sense of awe. The Valari hadn't simply fought them with superior technology, they had been confronted by something fundamentally alien, something that seemed to possess a rudimentary awareness. "Calon didn't understand stalemate," Marcus muttered, hefting his serrated knife. He saw only variables. He didn't see this. As they approached the shard, the swirling patterns in the mud intensified, coalescing into a vaguely humanoid form. It wasn't solid, not in the conventional sense. More like a distortion of the mud itself, a suggestion of limbs and a head, constantly shifting and reforming. Suddenly, a single, perfectly formed root thicker than a man's torso shot out from the swirling mass, aiming directly at Alara. Reacting instinctively, Marcus lunged forward, slashing at the root with his knife. The blade sank in, but instead of meeting resistance, It simply passed through the root, disappearing into the viscous mud with no trace. The root pulsed with an intensified blue light, and the swirling pattern in the mud solidified momentarily, revealing a fleeting image of face. Not a Valari face, sharp and predatory, but a human face ancient, weathered, and radiating a profound sadness. "It's not attacking us, Silas," the colony's aging botanist whispered, his voice filled with a strange reverence. "It's communicating. The mud remembers." Then, the ground beneath them began to tremble. The swirling patterns in the mud expanded outward, enveloping them in a suffocating embrace. Marcus felt a strange sensation, a loosening of his own memories, a fading of his personal history. He struggled to grasp onto the present, but the world around him was dissolving, replaced by images, not his own, but belonging to something vast and incredibly old. He saw a landscape teeming with life force of colossal, bioluminescent fungi, rivers of molten crystal, and creatures that defied description. He saw humanity not as the scattered, desperate colonists he knew, but as a single, unified civilization, deeply connected to the earth, wielding the power of the mud as a tool, not a weapon. He saw them building, not with metal and technology, but with living, growing structures, seamlessly integrated with the natural world. The vision abruptly ended, leaving Marcus gasping for breath, his head pounding. Elara was kneeling beside him, her face pale with shock. "It's showing us the origins," she said, her voice trembling. "The Valari aren't just conquering worlds, they're extinguishing memories. They're suppressing the knowledge of how to truly live with the earth." Silas, who had remained relatively unaffected by the initial onslaught, approached the shard, his hands outstretched. "The mud, it's not hostile. It's wounded. It's a repository of lost knowledge, of forgotten ways. It's trying to heal." He began to chant in a language none of them understood, a guttural, rhythmic incantation that seemed to resonate with the earth itself. As he chanted, the swirling patterns in the mud calmed, the pulsating blue light softened, and the humanoid form began to slowly dissipate. "We need to listen," Silas said, his eyes fixed on the diminishing form. "We need to learn to speak the language of the mud." Suddenly, Marcus noticed something he hadn't seen before. The mud wasn't just reacting to their presence, it was responding to Silas' chanting. The swirling patterns were forming words, not in any recognizable language, but in a complex geometric pattern that resonated with an almost palpable sense of urgency. The last image the mud projected before completely dissolving was not a threat, but a map, a vast, intricate network of subterranean waterways, stretching across the planet. And marked upon that map, with a single pulsing blue dot, was a location beneath the ruins of New Cumberland. The coordinates shifted, and as Marcus looked up, he realized the message wasn't just for them. The rain, which had been relentless for hours, began to slow, then stop completely. And as the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of pale sunlight, they saw a colossal fissure opening in the ground beneath their feet, revealing a cavern filled with an ethereal blue light, the source of the mud's power, the heart of its ancient memory. "It wants us to go down," Marcus said, a chilling realization dawning on him. "It wants us to fulfill our purpose." The air in the cavern hung thick with the scent of ozone, and something older, something akin to petrified rain, and the slow, patient decay of millennia. The blue light pulsed with an almost hypnotic rhythm, casting shifting, fractal patterns on the slick obsidian walls. Below, the swirling mud pool, now a perfectly still mirror-like surface, seemed to beckon. Silas, his face illuminated by the unnatural glow, moved forward, his boots silent on the damp stone. Marcus followed, his hand gripping the serrated knife, a primal instinct screaming at him to be cautious. "It's incredible, Doctor." Eris Thorne, the team's xenogeologist, breathed, his scanner buzzing furiously. "The concentration of rare earth elements here is off the charts. And the geological formations, they're not natural. They're sculpted. Sculpted by what? Marcus grunted, his eyes scanning the cavern's impossible geometry. Silas didn't answer immediately. He knelt at the edge of the pool, extending a hand towards the still water. As his fingers dipped into the mud, the blue light flared, and the air vibrated with a low, resonant hum. Images flooded his mind, not clear visions, but fragmented impressions, colossal figures wading through mud, as thick as blood, intricate patterns etched into the earth, and a sense of immense, sorrowful power. "It's communicating," Silas said, his voice strained. "It's showing me the builders." "The builders?" Eris questioned, adjusting his scanner. "You're saying this mud is sentient? That it's a repository of ancient knowledge?" "More than that," Silas replied, pulling his hand back, covered in the luminescent mud. "It's a guardian. It remembers, and it doesn't want us here." Suddenly, a tremor ran through the cavern. The blue light intensified, bathing the chamber in an almost unbearable brilliance. Marcus instinctively raised his knife, expecting an attack. But the threat didn't come from above. It came from within the mud itself. The still pool began to writhe, the swirling patterns accelerating into a dizzying vortex. The blue light coalesced into a humanoid form, towering over them, not a malevolent demon as Marcus had anticipated, but a being of pure, shimmering mud, vaguely reminiscent of a young man, his features sculpted by the swirling currents. "You trespass," the mud being said, its voice a chorus of whispers and the rustling of ancient earth. "This place is not meant for your kind." "We're not here to fight," Marcus said, holding his ground. "We're here to understand." "Understanding is a dangerous thing," the mud being countered. "It unravels the patterns. It disturbs the sleep." It raised a hand, and the cavern walls began to shift, revealing a series of intricate carvings, geometric symbols, that mirrored the patterns Marcus had seen in the mud. "These are the keys," the mud being explained, its voice growing stronger. "The key to the prime code. The code that sustains this world, that created you, that binds you to this place." Eris' eyes widened with excitement. The prime code. The legend spoke of it, a complex system of geomantic resonance, a way to manipulate the earth itself. "It is not a tool to be wielded," the mud being warned, a note of profound sadness in its voice. "It is a responsibility, a burden, and you are not ready for it." As it spoke, Marcus noticed something strange. The mud around the mud being was shifting, responding to its movements. It wasn't just reacting, it was mimicking him, echoing his gestures with unsettling precision. "What are you doing?" Marcus demanded, raising his knife. "I am showing you the truth," the mud being replied. "You are not apex predators. You are echoes, remnants. Your species' prime purpose has been lost, buried beneath layers of ambition and violence. You are a corruption of the code." Then, the mud being extended its hand, and the swirling patterns in the mud began to converge, forming a single, incredibly complex symbol, a spiral contained within a square. It pulsed with a blinding blue light, and Marcus felt a searing pain in his mind, a torrent of information flooding his consciousness. He saw images of a civilization far older than humanity, a civilization that had mastered the Earth's energy, a civilization that had ultimately destroyed itself through its own hubris. When the vision subsided, Marcus collapsed to his knees, clutching his head. Eris and Silas rushed to his side, helping him to his feet. "What did you see?" Eris asked, his voice filled with urgency. "It's gone," Marcus gasped, shaking his head. "But I know that we're not meant to control this world. We're meant to remember." The mud being remained motionless, its form subtly shifting, as if absorbing the echoes of their encounter. As the last vestiges of the blue light faded, it spoke one final time, its voice barely a whisper. "Listen to the mud," it said, "and perhaps you will find your way back to the pristine code."